Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue discussing Spelljammer. I've been talking about, of course, the various campaign settings you can find in AD&D or throughout Dungeons & Dragons history, and this one I started with D&D Adventures in Space. So where we last left off, we dove into a lot of the creatures and monsters you can encounter out when exploring the universe in Spelljammer. Let's dive into what you need to be a spacefarer. Dive a little bit more into that guidebook of information that's important. Now, not all of them, but the majority of Spelljammer adventures start off on a planet. They start out as Groundling adventures. So you're going to have to consider what your Groundling characters are going to know ahead of time, of course, and how their skills and abilities will relate to traveling in space. Now, what do they know ahead of time? What kind of information based around space might they know? They might know it's possible to travel into space, though it's difficult and dangerous. The exact way of doing this, that's unknown to them. They don't know if it's a powerful spell or magical ability, or perhaps some divine source. They probably may know about a Spelljammer, it's a possibility, but then again, they might not. Now, they might also know that the planets and moons that they see can be visited, the ones that are nearby to their planet. Of course, in the same retrospect, many of them are said to be barren places, and it is true that they are. So these kind of rumors will continue to be there also. You might hear about people that say they are from space and visiting the planet. Now, the combination of those that might be crazy are saying it, or those that are actually being truthful, is a fine line. And what your character believes is completely up to them, how they dive into a person that's saying they're from space. And even more so, those people that maybe are visiting your planet and said they were born and raised in space might sound even crazier. But, again, it's up to your character as how to interpret what they're hearing from this person and how much they may believe them, even as far-fetched and fanciful as it sounds. The other thing is, you're going to have to learn to respect those that you might find and meet that are from space, referring to you as a Groundling, because they're going to refer to it in the same way that your normal character might refer to a race like a Goblin's race, with this kind of disdain and kind of looking down on them. That's the exact same way these other races, these other folks, will talk to your Groundling brethren and yourself. Now, weapon proficiencies tend to travel over very easily into space. Majority of the same weapons most people use are used in space. And skills that are based around crafting weapons, or maybe sailing or crafting a ship, are very integral to space travel, so they translate very well. Other skills might translate well too. Things when you're like climbing and jumping are very easy. Jumping in between ships maybe, or climbing up into riggings. Healing, it's very important, because if you have skills in that, then of course, people get injured. Animal handling might even work. There are animal-like creatures out in space you might encounter. Granted, you will get a penalty because they are nothing like you met back on your planet, but you still could possibly use those same skills you learned in order to work with this animal. Any kind of construction, whether it's blacksmithing, carpentry, fletching, or something in between, are very important out in space. Repair to both weapons, armor, and ship can happen on the fly, so having these skills could be integral to helping your ship move from one point to another successfully, especially if it gets attacked. Cooking can be an important one. You need to eat something in space, and having just rations and hardtack might not be very good. You might want someone on the ship that will learn how to cook and be able to make something decent for you. Appraising. You might find treasures out there. You might want to know how much someone is paying you, especially if you're traveling to different spheres and different planets where money doesn't translate quite the same way. It might be that you have a certain amount of gold. You want to know how much gold they're really giving you. They want to know how much kind of their gems are and their worth. Things like that translate this trade in between the two groups. Of course, there are others, and you want to check the full list to see how they relate to you using them in space. But effectively, many of the skills you could possibly learn in your days on a planet translate excellently into space travel and might help you out along your way. Now let's break and dive down into many of the known spheres that you're going to visit, especially the ones based upon other campaign settings, because these are the important places that you're going to go to. I'm only going to start with one today, and in the next episode I'll move on to more of them. So the one I want to talk about today is the planet of Oerth in Greyspace, which is the setting for Greyhawk. Now, it actually tends to be the most well-traveled sphere by spelljamming ships, and one of the most ones populated by the most amounts of races. There's at least an outpost for every race that spelljams within Greyspace. Of course, the Elven Imperial fleet is known to have a particularly large presence there in this sphere, so a savage race or a pirating type group would be less inclined to go to this sphere than others. But for trade or communications or meeting with other races, it's a fine one to visit. Now, most of the time, this takes place on the outer planets of this entire system, because there's a sphere of asteroids that sort of form this shell that prevents it going deeper in towards Oerth, which is the center of the sphere. Many spelljamming ships will come into the sphere and will travel towards the outer edge of this asteroid field to various bases where they will conduct their trade. And then there are ships that are more well designed for traveling deeper through these asteroids and more experienced with it, which will take those trade goods from there in towards Oerth. So it seems to be this sort of two-way trade that only certain groups actually pass through the asteroid field. Now, when visiting the planet, most of the time, the free city of Greyhawk is the location they're going to visit. They're going to land in the water nearby and effectively sail in. Galleons and caravels are the most popular ships which visit, which appear much like the galleons and caravels that normally visit this city, except slight differences that most of the time people will pass off. So a large number of actually spelljamming ships are known to actually land there and travel into this city. Of course, this means that many races visit there. There are some that are actually kept out of Greyhawk. The Illithids and the Neogi are banned from it. Illithids, of course, because they have their history on the planet, but Neogi because they visited there one time or few times, and their race earned a reputation and effectively were banned. On the other hand, lizard men can visit there, but they are seen upon with prying eyes, as on most planets they are seen as very savage, unlike their spacefaring cousins. So effectively, they're looked at like their Groundling cousins, rather than the version of them that exists out in space. They have that lack of respect. Other cities are visited on Oerth, but with a lot of the discourse and wars and conflicts that are going on, many of them have become much more dangerous. Only certain ones are occasionally still visited, and information has changed sporadically that old guidebooks to the planet might take you to cities which it really isn't safe to go to anymore. The fact is that a lot of captains don't even bother going near it because of the conflicts nowadays, though there are still those that go to the city of Greyhawk, as it remains one of the more safer places on the planet anyway, so it still can be visited. Now let's talk about the basic races of it, the races that you'd see in the player's handbook. Of course, humans exist there, and they exist like humans in any other planet, and are willing to travel in space. Now the dwarfs of Oerth, they are much more integrated into human society rather often their own. A lot of their clan-based nature has been broken down on this planet, and they find themselves almost existing within the same societies as humans. This, of course, means that this change in the way that they think, that does make them much more of a connection with humans, means that dwarfs of space do not have contact with them or trade with them. They don't get along with them like they do with other dwarfs. Of course, on the other hand, this does mean that you can find crews of humans that seem to be like they would be only human crews, including dwarfs, even if they're from the planet, or they're just on the planet and perhaps figure out a way to travel away from it. This does mean that the Oerth and dwarfs, they do go into space, but very rarely. Most of the time they do not. And again, it would be as the occasional one that would decide to travel with a group of humans that were perhaps recruited to be a crew traveling into space. The elves of Oerth are very diverse and spread throughout many of the forests and various areas of it. There has been known to be contact between these spacefaring elves and them. Flitters and dragonflies have been known to land without spelljamming helms, of course, and give contact with them and often trade with their Groundling-based cousins. Now, direct connection between the admirals of the Elven Imperial Fleet and the rulers of the elves on Oerth happens very rarely, so it's mostly trade agreements that they effectively have, that any kind of major connections between leadership doesn't really exist. Now, the gnomes of Oerth are very ground-based. They believe they live underground. They're very rock, earthen-based, and they believe in family and clans, taking a role partially what dwarfs would have had on other planets, but not quite the same. But this also means that they tend to be very loyal to their families and not like to travel. This means very few Oerthan gnomes actually tend to travel into space, far fewer than any of the other races. The dwarves can still do it. They, of course, again, it's more or less they're going along with the humans because they don't have any connection to spacefaring dwarfs. But on the other end, this end, they don't like space. They like being underground. So the Oerthan gnomes, they just don't travel. Now, the Oerthan halflings, they are a mixed bag when it comes to that. They are creatures of the ground, similar to the gnomes, but they get perfectly along with the other races, especially dwarfs and humans, and can perfectly fit in with their society. They're much more individualistic than the gnomes, too, so the family connections don't exist to as much of a degree. This means that just as much as you can find a human of Oerth traveling into space, you can find a halfling of Oerth traveling into space. It's just as likely, and it's just as much of a chance to happen in the same amount, in the same way. So that's it for today. I introduced you, of course, to talking about what you as a groundling are going to have to sort of know, which you might know about space, and the kind of skills that you're going to be taking into space, which might be important. Then I dove into talking about one of the major realms that you may come from when traveling into space, or perhaps in your travels you may visit. In the next episode, I'm going to dive more into them with, of course, Greyspace, Realm Space, and then I will move into talking about Atlas and Ravenloft, two other locations that are homes to other campaign settings that you possibly still could visit in your explorations of space. So any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please just leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and of course subscribe. It shows support for the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, linked in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.